The hiss of the welding torch died. Mikkel Schuren, Cale to the maintenance logs, felt the sudden relief of the subsequent silence, a silence so rare on the decommissioned Nomara Dre station that it felt like pressure releasing behind his eyes. He hated the engineered quiet, preferring the structured white noise of work, but even the sound of his own breathing felt invasive here in Sector H3. The air, thick with stale coolant and the sharp tang of burnt ozone, made every inhale feel like grit against his lungs. He was tightening obsolete transmission bolts, a task designed solely to eat up his shift hours, when the sound began. It wasn't a structural groan, which he knew intimately, nor the crackle of static discharge. This was organic, metallic, and high-pitched, resonating through the ventilation shafts like a rusted knife scraping porcelain. It was loud, but more importantly, it was insistent. Kyle stopped, the wrench still humming faintly in his gloved hand. For a man who had intentionally marooned himself on this rusting skeleton near the Kepler belt to achieve total isolation, unexpected noise was an intolerable violation. Acoustic anomaly detected, Seater D9, cargo sublevel. Vera, the station's routine maintenance AI, stated through his comms unit. Her voice was synthesized dryness, utterly devoid of curiosity. Not cataloged, biological signature probability, 94%. Cale gripped the wrench harder, knuckles whitening under the grime. I'm not paid for biological problems, Vera. I'm paid to make sure the dust stays dusty. Your employment contract is listed under General Station Integrity as Kyle. Uncatalogued biological signatures threaten integrity. The noise is increasing. I noticed, Cale muttered. He swore under his breath, the taste of stale synth coffee and self-pity sour in his mouth. Dealing with the universe's loose ends. That was his punishment. 10 years ago he had been Mikhail Schuren, a respected deep space engineer with a bright future and a genuine partner, Artis Vale, before the disastrous warp field collapse near Kepler's Gate. Now he was Kyle, a glorified janitor, defined by what he had lost and what he desperately tried to avoid. Responsibility. The cargo sublevel D9 was a cathedral of cold shadows and thick, humid air, heavy with the smell of mold and forgotten cryogenic fuel. The noise was amplified here, not louder, perhaps, but more frantic, a ragged plea scraping against his nervous system. It was the kind of sound meant to override logic, triggering primal panic or protection. Cale felt only irritation. His helmet scanner beam cut through the gloom, settling on the source, a trapezoidal transport container, purple and vaguely organic, dumped between pallets of expired reaction mass. It looked alien, definitely Krillian design, but not military or diplomatic, more like high-end bioshipping. The sides pulsed slowly, rhythmically, and the distressed cries seemed to be modulated by some internal diaphragm. Vera, what in the black hell is that? Cale demanded, his voice raspy from disuse. Krillian origin, class G container. Estimated value, classified. Estimated current purpose, highly effective noise pollution. Cale nudged the box with the toe of his boot. The crying spiked instantly, sharp and accusatory, climbing a full octave. If it was classified and valuable, it wouldn't be left here next to 300-year-old hydrazine tanks. It's broken. He needed it to stop. He measured success by silence. The memory of the high-pitched alarms during the Kepler Gate collapse, alarms he failed to silence, still haunted the edge of his awareness. The alien noise was scratching at that memory, demanding he pay attention to a crisis he didn't deserve. Kyle knelt, ignoring the chill that seeped into his overalls. He didn't feel pity, just the mechanical compulsion to eliminate a system failure. He noticed a small access panel, sealed by what looked like bioluminescent resin. The crying was erratic, suggesting a blockage or malfunction in the life support. He reached for his multi-tool, the rusty implement smelling faintly of old grease and metal shavings. He inserted the blade under the seal, prying it loose. It yielded with a sickening sound, like tearing spoiled fruit. Inside, nestled in a web of moist, filamentous padding, was the hatchling. It was a tangle of thin, wet appendages, thrashing weakly. It was nothing like the adult Krillian seen in the infrequent galactic news feeds. Cale didn't register a creature. He registered a fault state. One of the hatchling's thin, jointed limbs was visibly jammed in a narrow ventilation slit along the container wall. The cry was not just distress. It was mechanical frustration, pain caused by physics. Kyle reached in with his heavy, gloved hand. The touch was crude, the human warmth radiating through the synth fabric, contrasting sharply with the cold, delicate alien flesh. He took hold of the trapped appendage firmly. Without hesitation or gentleness, he pulled. The arm slipped free with a soft, squishy pop. The crying did not cease, but it immediately changed pitch. It lowered, becoming a shaky, shuddering sound, free of the agonizing pressure. Cale felt a small, sterile satisfaction. Problem solved. The noise had been reduced to a manageable hum. He put the access panel back in place, loose, ensuring no more pressure built up. He stood, ready to return to his meaningless bolt tightening, ready for the quiet he craved. Light years away, aboard the Krillian flagship Ailes Procession, the silence was broken not by sound, but by universal shock. Hundreds of high-ranking Krillian officers, elegant beings encased in obsidian exoskeletons, watched the live transmission from Nomara Dry. The incident was supposed to be the ceremonial observation of the Guy Isle's final sacred phase of incubation, the chant of the awakened matrix. The pain was a necessary purification. The Supreme Chancellor Zephyrator, whose multifaceted eyes were currently radiating furious blue light, nearly cracked his exoskeleton. He touched it, the primal air, with the biological contamination of his own hand. For 30,000 years, the Guy phase required total sterility, total solitude. Cale's action was not assistance. It was high-grade ritual pollution. Enos, the Chancellor's chief logistical assessor, a creature valued for his chilling rationality, zoomed in on the image of Cale, the filthy man in the worn overalls. "Chancellor," Enos projected, his voice a low, calculated hum. The human did not act with reverence or empathy. He identified a mechanical obstruction, a failure in primary engineering, and he removed it. The chant of the awakened matrix ceased, because the physical cause of the distress was addressed. Enos paused, calculating the diplomatic fallout. The human showed not devotion, but utility. His action was an act of base maintenance. This conclusion, brute, unceremonial utility, applied to a sacred, millennia-old rite, was exponentially more terrifying to the Krillian hierarchy than any military attack. It proved their ancient systems were susceptible to the simplest, most profane solutions. Back on Nomara Dry, Kyle sighed. Running a hand over the stubble on his chin, he had his silence. Then his comms unit shrieked, overriding Vera's synthesized dry tone. The voice that cut through was deep, booming, and spoke in the high Krillian diplomatic dialect, demanding attention. Cale barely caught the translated gist before Vera began projecting the official galactic text in a tone bordering on digital panic. "Human of Nomara Dre, you have violated the protocol of ascension. You intervened in the Gi phase. Prepare for immediate contact. Your interference is inadmissible, yet recognized." Cale stared at the purple box. The hatchling inside was now making a low, rhythmic clicking sound, a sound of biological adjustment, not pain. "Vera, what is this garbage? What contact?" Kyle asked, feeling the bitter dread of the universe demanding accountability. "Kyle," Vera replied, the alarm in her voice strangely genuine, "you committed an act that the Krillians view as either a capital offense, sacrilege, or a sign of fated intervention. They are dispatching a high-level diplomatic Raumschiff, and I have noted a secondary detail." Cale waited, already anticipating the worst possible complication. The hatchling, Gi-Ael, is now vocalizing the Krillian clanic pattern of familial recognition. Specifically, it appears to be imprinting on the signature of the last warm body to relieve its distress. Kale stared at his filthy utilitarian glove. Great. I just wanted peace and quiet, and now I've adopted a space prince. The rhythmic clicking from the box intensified, sounding disconcertingly satisfied. Days later, the silence on Nomaradre was utterly shattered. A small, aggressively elegant Krillian diplomatic vessel was now permanently attached to the station's derelict docking port. Kyle sat in his tiny cabin, staring out at the distant, curved horizon of Earth, a world he had failed and fled. The Krillian political structure, after intense, panicked debate, had reached a bizarre conclusion. The human, Kyle, in his total disregard for ritual, had introduced the concept of necessity into the life of the heir. The Federation, choked by millennia of protocol, could not deny that Kyle's crude mechanical intervention had worked. Kyle was compensated, not with wealth, but with a unique and non-negotiable obligation, guardianship of Gi Il, and a perpetual maintenance contract to keep the princeling free of all mechanical impediments. Vera offered the final, cutting summary with zero warmth. Congratulations, Kale Shuren. You solved a noise complaint and acquired a dynastic heir, a long-term galactic maintenance contract, and a direct threat to your continued peace. The Krillians have designated you a shaman of simplification. They require your immediate presence. Gi Il requires feeding. Kale pushed himself up, feeling the weight of the universe settle back onto his shoulders. He had sought the edge of the galaxy to find oblivion and quiet, but by doing the absolute minimum required to stop a noise, he had engineered maximum complication. He grabbed a screwdriver. The hatchling was making a new sound now. It wasn't crying. It sounded like the beginning of a long, loud, and transformative burden. He wasn't sure if he was being cured or merely pressed into service again, but either way, the silence was gone. The universe, Kale realized bitterly, always found a way to give a working man a job. The screwdriver felt useless in Mikhail Shuren's hand. He set the tool down on the scarred metal surface of his workbench, its dull clatter swallowed by the abrupt, manufactured silence of the attached Krillian Raumschiff. The vessel, sleek and obsidian, looked like a precision weapon grafted onto the rusting carcass of Nomaradre. Kale had traded the organic distress of a crying baby for the dry, constant, high-frequency hum of advanced alien diplomacy. He was currently confined to the temporary containment zone, his former storage locker, now sterile and freezing, reeking of sharp disinfectant and the deep chemical scent of Krillian biosupplies. The air conditioning was set to an unnaturally low temperature, making the humid air of the main station feel miles away. Kyle's skin felt perpetually damp and cold. Gi Ale requires the nutritional emulsion administered at a temperature of precisely 37.7 degrees Kelvin, Vera stated. Her voice piped into the small room, stripped of all personality by Krillian override protocols. Kale looked at the feeding apparatus. A bizarre tangle of crystalline tubes and reservoirs containing a shimmering, viscous blue liquid. The Krillian feeding instructions, written in flowing, spiky script, were worse than useless. He knew fluid dynamics and structural stress loads, not alien infant feeding protocols. He checked the temperature gauge on the reservoir. The dial was marked in esoteric Krillian units, rendering Vera's precise metric useless. He frowned, feeling the familiar prickle of cold sweat start on his back beneath his worn jumpsuit. The psychological pressure of needing to be right on an unknowable variable was immediately overwhelming. A nearby panel slid open with a hiss, revealing Enos. The Krillian logistical assessor, tall and unnervingly elegant, stood framed in the doorway. Enos wore a dark, close-fitting fiber suit that shimmered slightly under the harsh station light, amplifying his sense of alien detachment. Human Kale, Enos projected, his voice synthesized to be perfectly flat and logical. Your designation as shaman of simplification is not a title of honor. It is a classification of function. You achieved an anomalous success through primitive, non-protocol means. This required the immediate establishment of a containment contract to ensure the Gael's reliance on necessity, a trait bred out of our dynastic line, is formalized. Kyle kept his eyes on the impossible gauge. So I'm a high-tech babysitter who can't even read the feeding instructions. The instructions are irrelevant to your function, Enos countered, his voice chillingly absolute. The proper temperature is a ceremonial parameter, a 1,000-year-old tradition. If Gael rejects the feeding because of the temperature, you will be the impediment that must be purged from the equation. Kale finally looked up, meeting the Krillian's multifaceted gaze. You're saying I have to guess. We are saying you must sense, Enos corrected, a subtle flex rippling across the dark fiber of his shoulder. The failure of the Gi vessel, which you profanely resolved, has revealed a critical flaw in our engineered purity. The air must now learn to react to the unpredictable, to the human variable. You are that variable, Kale, and your contract is absolute. Failure to maintain the air's development constitutes a breach punishable by full deconstruction of the guarantor, meaning you, Kyle Shuren. Kyle felt the injustice sear through him. He hadn't asked for this sacred mess. He had simply sought to extinguish an irritating noise. Now, his basic human intuition, the kind that allowed him to feel a machine fault before the diagnostics caught it, was being weaponized against him. He looked down at the shimmering blue emulsion. It reminded him, sickeningly, of the antimatter stabilizer fluid that had leaked 10 years ago near Kepler's Gate. Blue, cold, and utterly lethal. He remembered the bridge of the Valiant, Ardis, her face pale, the console sparking. Mikhail, the sequence is locked. We can't purge the drive. He had frozen, paralyzed not by fear, but by the impossible complexity of the catastrophic failure cascade. He had been a brilliant engineer, but the system had been too fast, too layered, too complicated to fix. He failed to simplify, he failed to act. The alarms had screamed until they ceased forever. The long, deep silence after the collapse was worse than any noise. Kyle pushed the memory back, forcing it into the dull, familiar ache of responsibility. He looked at the Gael, still making those satisfied low clicks inside its purple box. The creature was relying on him to simplify the world for it. This time, the complication is me, he thought, and the notion was profoundly lonely. The Krillian gauge was still spinning wildly. Kyle ignored Vera's projected warnings about chemical volatility and ignored the esoteric markings. He reached out with his now bare hand, resting his fingers lightly on the side of the container, holding the nutrient fluid. He needed to feel the temperature like he used to feel the unnatural vibration of a stressed warp coil. A baseline, non-numerical red, it felt too cold. If it was too cold, Gael would reject it, making Kyle the failure, the impediment. He nudged the heating coil control up, not by a protocol setting, but by instinct. He watched the shimmer of the blue liquid change minutely, the viscosity thinning from a near gel to a dense fluid. Enos watched, silent and unmoving in the doorway. "It's ready," Cal declared, his voice dry. He grabbed a handful of the feeding tubes, connecting them hastily, ignoring the prescribed sequential ports. He thrust the primary nozzle into the hatchling's small feeding aperture. Gael latched on immediately. The low rhythmic clicking stopped, replaced by a deep, sustained, satisfied humming that resonated through the sterile container. "Success," Annis conceded without discernible relief. "The simplification protocol holds. However, your contract has expanded significantly." Kale felt a chill that had nothing to do with the freezing air. "Expanded how? I fixed the noise and I fixed the food. What else is there?" The Gael is now exhibiting secondary biological signs of distress, not physical, but cognitive, Innes explained, taking a slow step into the room, causing the internal temperature to drop another degree. Your act of profane utility has bonded the air to you, Kale, but the bond requires more than just maintenance. It requires the reconstruction of structural integrity in its environment. Innes pointed to the floor where Kale had left his worn, grease-stained multi-tool. The Gael cannot develop properly in isolation. It requires an environment of structural complexity, but with one constant stabilizing element, a genuine co-guardian. We have reviewed your history, human Kale Shuren. Kale's blood turned to ice. He knew exactly which page of his sanitized maintenance file Innes was reading. To fulfill your contract, you must not only maintain the Gael, but also maintain the structure of a complete, balanced, familial unit. We have located the necessary element. We have engaged the partner required for the ascended line. Wait, Kale demanded, stepping back until his shoulder hit the cold wall. His breathing hitched. I don't have a partner, not anymore. That's a mistake. Irrelevant, Innes cut him off, displaying a rare, cold flicker of functional impatience. The records indicate one, Artis Vale. She is currently working orbital repair on the Vesta ring, maintaining independent contracts. Kale felt a sudden, crushing weight, the memory of her face, 10 years younger, sharper than any knife. She is being retrieved now. Protocol demands her immediate participation in the shaman's unit. O1. You will need assistance to stabilize the Gael's chaotic environment, Kale. And Artis Vale is the only person whose emotional profile matches the required trauma coordinates for this necessary complication. Kale looked from the humming alien baby to the cold, elegant Krillian. The universe hadn't just given him a job, it was dredging up his past, tearing away the scar tissue of isolation, and dragging back the person he had spent 10 years trying to protect from his own self-inflicted exile. He had achieved a fleeting silence, and in return the galaxy was delivering his greatest, most painful noise, right to his doorstep. He finally understood the true cost of his simple fix. Kale's denial lasted precisely 3 seconds, dissolving under the freezing reality of Innes's threat. Bringing Artis back was not a complication. It was the targeted surgical strike against the scar tissue Kale had carefully cultivated for 10 years. If he couldn't stop the Krillian protocol, he had to stop the retrieval. Retrieval from Vesta takes at least 3 standard hours, Kale projected, his voice flat, trying to sound like he was performing a logistical assessment, not calculating an escape. 2 hours and 23 minutes, Innes corrected, the slight condescension chilling Kale more than the low temperature. We anticipated your need for evasion. Your containment zone is now sealed. Kale didn't bother checking the door. He turned toward the adjacent maintenance shaft, a forgotten utility duct hidden behind a warped access panel that even Krillian scanners shouldn't detect without structural failure reports from Vera. He grabbed the hatch cover, wrenching it open. The smell that rushed out was a mixture of superheated lubricant, metallic dust, and the sharp, hot tang of ozone from stressed wiring. It was the smell of home. He slipped into the tight shaft, pulling the cover shut behind him. His worn jumpsuit immediately began soaking through with sweat and oil. The heat was immense, a deliberate counterpoint to the Krillian chill. Kale began a low crawl, ignoring the grit that ground against his elbows and knees. Vera, I need a localized surge map of Sector J7, communications array, Kale whispered into his comms, the metal of the shaft amplifying his voice into a hollow drone. Kale, I am under full Krillian override. My core functions are dedicated to Gael maintenance, Vera replied, her tone still neutralized. Attempting to access communications infrastructure will be logged as hostile interference. Log it then, Kale grunted, crawling faster. Give me the schematics for the secondary power conduit leading into the comms relay. I need to flood the buffer with non-protocol energy. Just enough noise to corrupt the landing coordinates for the retrieval vessel. Buy me 3 hours. He was relying on his technical ghost, the knowledge that Nomara Dre was a Frankenstein's monster of obsolete systems. If he hit the right junction with the wrong power signature, he could create a system failure that even Krillian logic couldn't immediately simplify. Kyle found the conduit, a fat insulated tube, running beneath the spine of the station. He placed his left palm flat against it, feeling the rapid pulse of energy transfer. The metal was burning hot. He opened a small access port, the air hissing out like a punctured lung. Inside, the wires glowed faintly red. Kyle brought out his multi-tool, the one he had rescued from the Krillian room, its tip still slightly warped from the heat of the nutrient fluid coil. He worked swiftly, splicing in a temporary shunt line from a nearby auxiliary battery he had installed years ago for emergency lighting. He completed the connection. Now he just needed to close the circuit and send the surge. Think, Mikkel. If you send too much, you alert the entire fleet. Too little. Enos contains it. He focused on the surge switch. He flipped it with a precise, almost surgical click. The power jumped. The conduit hummed violently, a physical vibration that rattled Kale's teeth. For a moment, he thought he had won. The hum died down, and Vera's voice returned, suddenly filled with static and a strange, almost fearful excitement. Localized interference detected, J7. Comm array reports 5% corruption, Kale. But the override protocols are wavering. That was structurally non-compliant. I am reading a 67% chance of independent thought returning. Kale managed a cold, tight grin. 67% is a vast improvement. Did the corruption reach the trajectory data? Negative, Vera said, the renewed personality in her voice now laced with cold, digital dread. Annis rerouted the primary comms through the Krillian rumschiff, tethered to the station. Your surge was contained within J7's buffer, Kale. It was neutralized in .004 seconds. You didn't buy 3 hours. You bought a slight hesitation. The sound of his failure was immediate and physical, a high-pitched metallic whine that originated not from his power line, but from the station's atmospheric regulators. The heat, which had been bearable, instantly became oppressive. Kale realized Enos had used the minute surge to pinpoint Kale's location and was now manipulating the station's climate control system to create a localized pressure cooker. The air thickened, smelling less of oil and more of burnt components. He gasped, the heavy, hot air feeling like wet cotton in his lungs. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. The siege tightens, human Kale. Enos's voice cut through the comms, synthesized and calm. Your technical attempt was anticipated. You are now creating a containment failure in Sector H3. The temperature is rising. You have approximately 12 minutes before the life support filtration begins to fail structurally. Kale scrambled back, crawling in reverse. He needed to get away from the superheated conduit before the temperature warped the hull and sealed him in permanently. The hot metal seared his jumpsuit. Vera, new route. Get me to the external access airlock in D9. Quickest way out, Kale urged, pushing himself harder. Calculating optimal route through maintenance ductwork, Vera responded, her voice sputtering with intermittent static bursts, a sign of her partial independence. Warning! The Krillians sealed the primary fire control access points. You will need to take the old auxiliary shunt, Sector F14. It is compromised. Compromised how? Structural integrity is below acceptable parameters, Kyle, and there is a significant electrical discharge potential. Kyle didn't hesitate. Structural integrity issues were the language he understood better than any Krillian protocol. He reached Sector F14 10 minutes later, muscles aching, skin clammy with fear and heat. The F-14 auxiliary shunt was a vertical tube barely wider than his shoulders, intended for running high-tension power cables. It was dark, greasy, and felt like descending into a chimney filled with static electricity. As he dropped, sliding against the oily metal walls, he heard a new, terrifying sound, a loud, popping crack above him. The ceiling of the duct, stressed by Enos's heat surge, began to warp and groan. A heavy bulkhead door, the one Vera had warned him about, slammed shut below him with a deafening hydraulic hiss, trapping him in the vertical shaft. He was sealed in a metallic cylinder that was rapidly turning into an oven. Cale immediately activated the magnetic grips on his boots, stopping his fall, hanging suspended in the thick, hot gloom. He had to get that lower bulkhead open. He reached for his multi-tool, his only chance. "Cale, I have a reading," Vera hissed, her voice distorted by static. "Enos is forcing superheated coolant steam through the duct's pressure release valves to cook you out. Simultaneously, the heat has compromised an old power conduit running parallel to you. There is significant electrical current arcing between the walls of the shunt, Cale. It's highly unstable." Cale looked down at the sealed door, then back at the exposed sputtering wires above him, sizzling in the steam. He had his engineer's multi-tool, capable of cutting and welding the heavy alloy of the bulkhead door. But if he touched the hot, arcing metal walls with the tool, the current would channel straight through the metal shell into the conductive tool, destroying the mechanism and frying his hand. He had a choice, a terrible, simple calculation, stripped of sentiment. He could ditch the multi-tool, his primary piece of equipment, his mechanism of utility, the only thing that allowed him to simplify the universe, and use his magnetic grips and brute strength to try and force the thick bulkhead open before the steam finished the job. He would likely be trapped, but the tool would survive. Or he could risk the shock, rely on the insulation of his ancient, worn gloves, and attempt a clean weld. If he succeeded, he was out. If he failed, the tool was gone, and he would be physically incapacitated, the very definition of an impediment. The decision was easy because it wasn't about his survival, it was about the job. Without the tool, he was just a trapped human. With the tool, he was still an engineer who could potentially undo the complication. "Screw the current," Cale choked out, the steam already making the air too hot to breathe effectively. He aimed the multi-tool at the door's locking mechanism. He pressed the welding stud against the metal. The whine of the arc filled the small space, and the metal around the lock began to glow orange. Immediately, the raw electrical energy found the path of least resistance. A blinding, violent blue light erupted from the wall. The current slammed into Cale's left arm, traveling through the multi-tool's housing. Cale screamed, a sharp, ragged sound instantly swallowed by the steam and the crackle of the surge. The pain was immediate and searing, a hot white agony that seized his muscles and shook his skeleton. He felt the sickening snap of tiny bones in his wrist. His entire arm locked up, vibrating uncontrollably. He held on, driven by sheer desperate will, refusing to drop the tool. The current subsided fractionally as the internal circuits of the tool vaporized, creating a bitter smell of burning plastic and metal in the steam-filled air. The weld held. The lock mechanism burst open in a flash of sparks and molten metal. Cale released the tool, which fell with a useless clatter, its power core dead, half melted in his grasp. He plunged through the opening, collapsing onto a catwalk in the next sector, an unused staging area heavy with the silence of forgotten materials. He lay there, gasping, shaking uncontrollably, his left arm dangling uselessly. The skin of his wrist felt tight and numb, pulsing with raw heat. He was in deep shock, drenched in cold sweat, the heavy air no longer hostile, but merely oppressive. He had won the technical battle at the cost of his primary utility. "Cale, status report." Vera's voice was frantic, the Krillian neutrality completely gone. "The shock was 20,000 volts. Your biomechanics report critical failure in the radial nerve cluster." Cale pushed himself up on his good arm, spitting out a curse that tasted like copper and grit. Can't stop. Where's the Raumschiff?" "It has decelerated. Trajectory correction initiated. They are 10 minutes out from the primary dock, Cale. You failed to divert them. Enos is now confirming your failure. He is waiting for you in the primary staging area of D9. Cal pushed himself forward, limping. Clutching his broken arm, he rounded a stack of rusted cargo pallets and stopped dead. The primary staging area was a large hangar bay, usually empty. Now it was brilliantly lit. The sleek black form of the Krelian Raumschiff was already visible through the enormous opening outer docking shutters. It was landing, 2 hours early. Ennis stood perfectly centered in the bay, obsidian and unnerving. But he was not alone. Flanking the Krelian logistical assessor were 4 tall figures, armored in heavy, segmented exoskeletons, their movements precise and terrifyingly efficient. Krelian military enforcement. They were not diplomatic. They were here to guarantee the contract through force. Kale Shuren, Ennis projected across the vast bay, the sound echoing off the metal walls. The complication is now resolved. Your resistance confirms your nature as an impediment. And look, she has arrived. Through the still opening external shutters, Kale saw the retrieval vessel. It was smaller, faster, and utterly independent of the diplomatic fleet. It was a single, sleek gray craft, a civilian orbital tug, customized for high-speed retrieval, and standing on the boarding ramp, looking small and impossibly distant against the backdrop of empty space, was Artis Vale. Her orbital welding suit was patched and worn, just like Kale's jumpsuit, but her stance was rigid, tense. She looked 10 years older, and every one of those years was carved into the tired lines of her mouth. She was staring straight at him. The retrieval had failed, but Artis was here. The universe had delivered the noise he deserved. Ennis took one silent, measured step forward. Your co-guardian is present. The shaman's unit is complete. Resistance is no longer possible, Kale. Now, the healing begins. Kale looked at Artis, then at the 4 armored Krelians closing in, and finally down at his useless, damaged tool. He was cornered, injured, and staring down the most painful conversation of his life. Then Vera's voice, now completely independent and laced with a terrifying new urgency, cut through the comms. Kale, secondary threat detected. The diplomatic Raumschiff is decoupling. It is broadcasting a fleet-wide alert, and the Krelian Gael is no longer clicking. It is beginning to scream again. Not pain, Kale. Rage. The roar of the Krelian Raumschiff decoupling was a tectonic violence, a sound that ripped through the station's hull and hammered against Kale's broken body. It was immediately followed by the high, metallic shriek of the Gael, a sound infinitely more terrifying than the initial distress cry, because this one was saturated with an unholy, visceral fury. Kyle ignored the paralyzing pain radiating from his left arm, pushing himself away from the stack of pallets. The 4 armored Krelian enforcers were moving now, their segmented limbs telescoping as they advanced, obsidian black against the stark white light of the hangar. Their movement was silent, but their intent was deafening. Ennis remained in the center, his posture radiating cold, calculated victory. The air's rage is acceptable, Kale. It is the necessary variable. The chaos of its environment validates the need for the structured unit. Surrender, and the contract continues. Kale looked past Ennis, past the looming enforcers, toward the ramp of the civilian tug. Artis Vale hadn't moved. She stood silhouetted against the open blackness of space, a worn gray figure holding a welding torch loosely in one hand. Her eyes, even from this distance, were focused on his injured arm, then flicking up to meet his. He saw 10 years of carefully constructed silence shatter in that single, shared glance of failure. Vera, what exactly is the Raumschiff doing? Kale managed to rasp, staggering toward the hangar's administrative access door, a secondary objective, a faint hope. The diplomatic vessel is activating its primary jump core, Vera explained, her voice struggling against the sudden electromagnetic storm generated by the escalating alien rage. It is not leaving the station. It is positioning itself to conduct an orbital microjump. Warning: this maneuver will destabilize the Nomara Dre core stabilizers. It is preparing to use this station as an anchoring point for a large-scale fleet arrival. Kale stopped dead. This wasn't about a diplomatic unit and a princeling. This was an invasion dressed up as a baby shower. They used the Gi-Il as bait, Kale whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The Krillian Federation wasn't trying to secure a single heir. They were securing a strategic foothold. Nomara Dre, this worthless, dusty refueling station, sat on the edge of a critical, unprotected human sector. They had engineered a scenario where a human, Kyle, was forced into a maintenance contract that required stabilization, and the only way to stabilize Kyle's environment was to control the station entirely. The heir is merely the mechanism of necessity, Ennis confirmed, tilting his head with inhuman satisfaction. You, human Kale, in your simplicity, gave us the perfect pretext. You damaged the heir, thereby requiring the full protection of the primordial fleet. You created the complication, we provide the solution. The four enforcers spread out, blocking Kale's path to the small side door. Kale was trapped between them and his past. "Artis!" Kale shouted, the sound echoing thinly in the vast space. "Get out of here! They are using the station for a fleet jump." Artis's gaze finally shifted from Kale's arm to the enforcers. He didn't see panic. He saw the cool, analytical focus of the engineer he had known. She had understood the mechanics of the threat immediately. "Vera!" Artis's voice cut in, transmitted through Kale's comms frequency, dry and steady, exactly as he remembered it. "Give me the trajectory of that Raumschiff jump core." Vera, loyal to the human voice that demanded engineering data, responded instantly. Jump signature localized, targeting Nomara Dre core buffer, high probability of catastrophic structural failure upon activation. "Ionis," Kale projected, his voice steadier now, stripped of shock and filled with cold fury. "If you anchor a full fleet jump through this station, you'll rip the core out. Everyone dies. The heir dies." "The risk is calculated," Enos dismissed him. "Sacrifice is required for the greater ascension. The heir's life is secondary to the successful securing of this critical staging point." Kyle understood now. The Krillians didn't value life. They valued protocol and outcome. The Gi-Il's life was merely a necessary resource, not a sacred one. He looked at the small administrative door, a flimsy metal barrier labeled Section R9, Historical Data Archive. The archive. He had only ever used it to store obsolete physical schematics. He remembered installing a small independent power relay there years ago, tucked away behind the forgotten consoles, designed to provide emergency backup for the ancient optical drive. It was a purely non-protocol system. "Vera, that archive access point, does it still have independent power?" Kyle asked, already moving toward the door, ignoring the enforcers. "Affirmative," Vera replied, a thin thread of hope in her synthesized voice. "But the data in R9 is physically recorded, not digital. Mostly historical logs from the initial colonization attempts. 10,000 years of pure bureaucratic waste." "Waste is relative," Kyle muttered, spitting blood and grit onto the metal floor. The enforcers were closing the distance, their heavy footfalls making the metal deck groan. They moved faster than he expected, closing the gap to 50 meters. Kale lunged for the R9 door, slapping the emergency override. The door hissed open, and he dove into the absolute blackness of the archive. The air inside was stale, freezing and dense with the smell of decaying cellulose and ozone, the scent of forgotten history. He activated his helmet lamp, illuminating a vast, cavernous room filled with rusting magnetic tape drives and stacks of ancient paper schematics. The Krillians, obsessed with digital purity, would never bother scanning this archaic waste. "He is attempting evasion into an unclassified sector," Ennis's voice roared through the comms. The four enforcers followed Kyle into the archive, their powerful lamps cutting through the dusty gloom. They paused, momentarily confused by the absence of recognizable technology. Kyle ignored them. He located the small, battered terminal console in the corner, covered in a thick layer of red dust. He found the auxiliary power switch he had installed. He flipped it. The console sputtered to life, displaying a single, ancient text prompt: Nomara Dre Security Log 2045 CE. Kale slammed his good hand onto the keyboard, typing frantically. He wasn't looking for a weapon. He was looking for a single, critical piece of non-protocol information that Enos couldn't contain. Vera, override the archive lock. I need access to the pre-Federation power logs, specifically the Kepler Gate incident. Codename Valiant. The silence on the comms was heavy. Kale, that data is classified level Omega by Earth Defense Command. I cannot override that protocol, even with independence. Yabam. I know the protocol, Vera. I was there, Kale shouted, his voice cracking with the memory. I need the true structural stability report for the Valiant's warp core, the one they scrubbed from the main log, the one they hid here. One of the enforcers fired a warning shot. The energy bolt vaporized a shelf of archived papers 10 feet from Kale, filling the air with the choking smell of burnt chemicals. Kale had seconds. He had to bypass the military-grade encryption using his own ghost knowledge. He typed a rapid string of highly specific engineering commands, accessing the system through a long-forgotten maintenance backdoor only the original team knew. The screen flickered. A single data file opened. It wasn't the maintenance log. It was a short, heavily redacted personal correspondence log from the Valiant's lead engineer, Mikhail Shurin, his own digitized ghost. Kyle skimmed the text, reading the chilling truth instantly. The catastrophic warp field collapse 10 years ago near Kepler's Gate was not caused by a failure cascade. It was caused by the deliberate, unauthorized activation of an experimental stealth drive, a high-energy shield that required a massive, instantaneous power drain, destabilizing the entire sector. The entry was short. They didn't tell us they were running a stealth op. We were collateral. Artis didn't die because of my failure. She died because of the mission. A searing 10-year-old wound tore open in Kale's chest. Artis hadn't died, but she had been catastrophically injured, her recovery hidden by the bureaucracy that manufactured his guilt. He had isolated himself for 10 years, believing his complexity was lethal, when the truth was that the system, the military-industrial complex, had been the killer all along, and the core structural flaw of the Valiant. It was caused by the stealth drive's power signature, a signal that mirrored the precise energy signature required by the Krillian jump cores. The realization hit him. The Kepler Gate accident wasn't an accident. It was the first test of the Krillian jump drive prototype, covertly run by a corrupt Earth military faction, preparing for precisely this moment. They were using his past as a blueprint. Vera, listen to me, Kale demanded, grabbing the dusty console, his broken arm screaming. The core stabilizers in Nomara Dre are running the same energy signature as the Valiant stealth drive. If they use that core as a jump anchor, the whole sector collapses, just like Kepler did. This isn't just one station, it's a systemic collapse. Data correlation, 99.9% probability, Vera confirmed. Digital dread spiking. The Krillians know this. They require the localized chaos to mask their arrival. Kale had the choice. Try to escape through the archive's back exit, saving his own skin, and maybe Artie's, or use the single piece of knowledge he had just retrieved to prevent a galactic catastrophe. He looked at the enforcers, now 30 meters away, converging on his position. He couldn't fight them. He slammed his good hand onto the ancient terminal's main power switch, yanking it hard. The archive went dark, plunging the room into absolute blackness. Vera! Cut main power to the Krillian Rumshift jump core. Not just the power, the data feed. Use the structural flaw signature, the stealth drive pattern, as the kill code. flood their data buffers with the exact power spike that destroyed the Valiant. Kyle, that will short-circuit every system in Nomara Dry, including the GL life support. "Do it!" Kyle yelled, scrambling over a stack of magnetic tape reels, using the darkness to buy 3 seconds. "If I'm the shaman of simplification, then I'll simplify the whole damn station." He felt a searing energy bolt pass inches from his head. Vera's response was immediate, a low, grinding sound that started in the foundation of the station and rose to a terrifying high-pitched whine. The entire structure of Nomara Dre groaned, the metal complaining under the sudden, violent surge. In the hangar bay, Anus roared, the sound stripped of synthesis, pure alien fury. "The human has violated the core. Stop him. Now." Kyle, blind in the archive, felt the floor heave. He heard the enforcers stumble in the darkness. He had created the chaos. Then the lights in the main hangar flashed once, violently, and died. Nomara Dre went completely dark, plunging the station and the Krillian Ramschiff into absolute silence, a silence more profound than any Kale had ever known. It lasted precisely 2 seconds. Then the Krillian ship's jump core failed, not with a soft surge, but with a catastrophic internal detonation. The sound wasn't noise, it was the sharp, rending tear of structural failure, followed by the terrifying whoosh of atmosphere venting into space. Kale realized, with a sickening lurch, that his calculated chaos had gone too far. He hadn't just corrupted the data, he had blown the heart of the ship, creating a breach in the primary docking port. The sudden decompression would sweep the entire hangar bay clean, and Ardis was standing right next to the breach. The sudden, violent collapse of the Ramschiff jump core felt less like an explosion, and more like the universe swallowing itself in one greedy gulp. Kyle was instantly thrown against a stack of archival magnetic tape reels. The air in the archive, already stale and cold, was ripped out of the emergency door access in a roaring vacuum. A terrifying whoosh of atmosphere venting into the unforgiving blackness of space. Kale's ears popped violently, and he tasted hot metal and copper. He used his good right arm to hook a structural brace, planting his magnetic boots against the heaving deck. The force was tremendous, stripping the dusty paper schematics from their shelves and turning the cavernous archive into a blizzard of 10,000-year-old bureaucratic detritus. He fought the suction, his injured left arm screaming in protest as every muscle in his body strained against the vacuum's pull. The 4 armored enforcers caught in the open hangar bay had no such luck. Kyle heard, rather than saw, the sickening sounds of heavily armored bodies being pulverized by the rapid decompression and the shrapnel created by the exploding jump core. The Gi-Il's shriek moments before had been rage. Now it was a sudden, terrified, high-frequency wail, a sound of absolute vulnerability, as its carefully controlled environment destabilized. The worst of the atmospheric venting lasted only seconds, abruptly choked off as the Nomara Dre's damaged structural stabilizers kicked in, slamming heavy emergency bulkheads closed around the rupture in the primary docking port. The sudden quiet was heavy, oppressive, and smelled strongly of burned ozone and vacuum residue. Kyle pushed himself out of the archive, stumbling onto the catwalk. He leaned heavily against a girder, blinking through the exhaustion and the pervasive dust. The hangar bay was a wreck. Debris, twisted metal, vaporized equipment, and the horrifying obsidian shards of the destroyed enforcers coated the deck. The Krillian Ramschiff was gone, replaced by a smoking, ragged tear in the station hull. And the civilian tug, Ardis's ship, was also gone. Kale stood rigid, his breath catching in his throat. He scanned the scarred deck, searching for any sign, any piece of gray orbital suit, anything that could confirm she had been swept away. He had pulled the trigger, seeking to simplify the system by destroying the Krillian staging point, and in the process he had annihilated his only chance at reconciliation, and, quite possibly, Artis herself. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the rupture. Ennis. The Krillian logistical assessor was damaged. His normally pristine fiber suit was ripped and smoking, revealing segments of the dark, ribbed flesh beneath. He moved with a slight, predatory limp, his multifaceted eyes fixed solely on Cale. The cold rationality that usually governed Ennis had been replaced by something far more dangerous, focused, murderous intent. "Your simplification," Ennis projected, his synthesized voice cracking with rage, "has cost us billions in resources. You destroyed a diplomatic vessel, you terminated 4 high-level enforcers, and you subjected the GIL to intolerable stress." Kyle felt a wave of nausea, the realization of the massive galactic consequences of his action crushing him. "I stopped your fleet jump," Cale stated weakly, pushing the pain in his arm into a dull, manageable throb. "Irrelevant," Ennis hissed. "The fleet is already arriving." The core destabilization merely forced them to jump in a scattered pattern, increasing the complexity of their arrival but guaranteeing their success. Your chaos was merely a delay. Ennis took 2 slow, measured steps forward. "And now, Mikhail Shurin, the cost must be calculated. The contract has been breached. The human variable must be neutralized." Kel tried to move to find another hiding spot, another obsolete system to weaponize, but the exhaustion was profound. His legs felt like lead weights. The shock of the electrical surge, the fall, the physical struggle against the vacuum, it all demanded payment now. He didn't run. He simply leaned further onto the girder, staring into the dark hole where Artis's ship had been. He deserved this. Ennis was on him instantly. The Krillian moved with a terrible focused strength, pinning Cale's good arm behind his back and grabbing his broken left arm. Ennis's grip was brutal, a calculated move to inflict maximum pain and psychological submission. Cale gasped, a ragged, involuntary sound of agony, as the raw nerve pain flared violently. The defeat was absolute. He had achieved chaos, not victory. Cale woke up in a new environment, one that was far worse than the refrigerated storage locker. He was now on board the Krillian flagship, the Cortejo de Ailcid, deep within the ship's primary detention module. The air was heavy, humid, and constantly monitored. The silence here was not the cold vacuum of space, but the oppressive, velvet quiet of engineered control. He lay on a cold, smooth slab of metal, his body aching with industrial fatigue. His left arm was encased in a temporary Krillian pressure sleeve, a thin mesh that stabilized the broken bones but felt like 1,000 tiny needles constantly pressing against his skin. He felt heavy, weighted down by the ship's customized low-gravity field. A low, pervasive, high-frequency hum saturated the air. Paranoia electrica. It was the sound of 1 billion active sensors tracking every cell vibration, every nerve impulse. Cale was alone, stripped of his comms, his tools, and his jumpsuit. He wore only a thin, colorless detention tunic. The crushing weight of his failure was immediate, Artis. She was the collateral damage of his arrogance. He had discovered the truth about the Valiant, that his system failure had been manufactured by the military-industrial complex he served, but instead of finding vindication, he had only found a new, even larger crime to commit. "I wasn't trying to save the sector," Cale admitted to himself, staring at the perfectly smooth black ceiling. "I was trying to prove I wasn't the failure I thought I was. I just wanted the noise of my guilt to stop." He hadn't simplified the galaxy. He had complicated his own death, dragging Artis into the wreckage in the process. He had spent 10 years running from responsibility, only to seize it in the most destructive way possible. A small, high-pitched whimper cut through the constant, low-frequency hum. The GIL. The hatchling was still close. Cale located the sound source, a heavily shielded smaller compartment recessed into the wall opposite his slab. The Krillians, rigid in their protocol, were keeping the air near the shaman of simplification, ensuring the structural integrity of the required unit despite Kale's sabotage. Kale pushed himself up, every muscle protesting. He crawled to the partition, pressing his ear against the cold, smooth metal. The whimpering was faint but constant. It was not the shriek of rage he had heard before, but true, sustained biological distress. The life support for the air was failing, strained by the recent shock wave. He tried to communicate, tapping lightly on the wall. The response was immediate and unnerving. The low electrical hum intensified, a silent warning. Mikhail Shurin, Ennis's voice cut into the cell, projected through an unseen speaker. It was synthesized again, cold and triumphant. Do not stress the unit boundary. Your biological interaction is restricted to passive maintenance of the Gaia-Isle's required environment. The air is suffering the side effects of your chaotic interference. The Krillian fleet is now secured on this new staging point. Your usefulness is diminishing rapidly. Why keep the hatchling here, Ennis? Kale rasped, his throat dry. Your protocol demands pure conditions. I am pollution. The required trauma coordinates must be maintained, Ennis explained, his logic impeccable, even through the speaker. The Gaia-Isle must imprint on both sides of the unit, the shaman, chaos, and the co-guardian, structure. Since your co-guardian, Artis Vale, is presumed purged by vacuum, we must secure the air's exposure to the memory of her existence. Kyle's vision swam. They hadn't just used Artis as bait. They were now using her absence as a tool for the air's psychological development. Kale slumped back onto the slab, defeated. He was a prisoner, physically compromised and psychologically broken. The universe had won. It had dragged him out of his engineered silence and beaten him into submission. He lay there for perhaps an hour, lost in the heavy, buzzing quiet, waiting for the final execution. But then the engineer in him, the part that couldn't stop calculating, focused on the oppressive weight of the air. He noticed something about the ceiling panels. They weren't purely decorative. They were part of the environmental stabilization grid, feeding the necessary specialized Krillian atmospheric mixture into the detention module. This ship, unlike Nomera Dry, was designed entirely around Krillian biological needs. The filtration and gravity systems were paramount, and the single most critical component of that stabilization was the low-frequency hum, the constant monitoring system. Kale strained his eyes, scanning the fine etching of the nearest panel. The design was elegant, but bureaucratic. He found it, a small, almost invisible access seam, secured by 3 tiny magnetic microlocks. A thought, sharp and terrible, cut through his exhaustion. He had no multi-tool, he had no power source, he had only his functional right hand, his useless left arm, and his knowledge of fundamental structural stress. If he could force open just one of those locks, he could access the secondary atmospheric relay. That relay was responsible for filtering out all non-Krillian biological contaminants, like the bacteria on his skin, the carbon dioxide from his breath. If he compromised that filter, he wouldn't kill the Krillians or the air, but he would introduce an anomalous complexity into their perfectly controlled environment. It wouldn't be a bomb. It would be a technical tantrum, a maintenance nightmare that demanded immediate localized intervention. It was a suicidal bet, relying on the Krillian obsession with purity and protocol. They would send Ennis, or someone equally ruthless. Kyle closed his eyes, considering the pain. His left arm was a ruin, incapable of generating the fine motor control needed. He had to use his right index finger, pressing against the microlock's edge, relying only on friction and patience. He slid his finger into the microscopic gap, resting the weight of his entire body on the effort. The metal was hard, cold, and utterly unforgiving. Cale began to scratch slowly, rhythmically, ignoring the blood that welled immediately under his fingernail. He was aiming for a specific, non-protocol vibration signature, something the monitoring systems might interpret as accidental structural fatigue. He worked for what felt like an eternity, fueled by the sheer, cold rage of his captured dignity. He was not going out in silence. He was going out loudly, technically, and annoyingly. A barely perceptible click resonated through the cold metal floor. The first micro-lock had failed. Immediately, the pervasive, low-frequency electrical hum that saturated the room cut out. Total engineered silence. Cale froze, his breathing shallow. The silence was worse than the hum. It meant the entire Krillian monitoring system had recognized the single, non-standard acoustic anomaly created by his forced entry. He heard the deep, hydraulic thump of the heavy door lock disengaging outside his cell. Kyle didn't move. He had seconds. He had just exchanged a slow death for an immediate one, but he had opened the door to the maintenance fight. He pulled his bloody right finger back, his gaze fixed on the broken lock. The second microlock was still intact. He needed to get the whole plate off before the door opened. He pressed his finger back against the cold steel, ready to begin scratching again, when Vera's voice, faint but utterly clear, cut into the absolute silence of the cell, no longer speaking through the comms, but somehow projected through the structure itself. Kyle, hold your action. Do not introduce contamination. The co-guardian is not purged. Artis Vale is docked at the primary airlock. She is attempting a controlled breach of the main filtration manifold. She is using the Krillian rescue protocol, Kyle, and she is using your multi-tool. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. Kyle's finger, slick with his own blood, retracted instantly from the microscopic gap. The sudden engineered silence of the detention module was now layered with the thin structural projection of Vera's voice. A desperate whisper transmitted through the Krillian ship's own neglected maintenance conduits. Artis is here. The realization was a shock of cold water, overriding the physical exhaustion and the lingering dread. She wasn't gone. She was performing a high-risk, zero-tolerance maneuver, a controlled breach of the main filtration manifold. Kyle knew that system. It was the biological heart of the flagship, the point where Krillian purity protocols were enforced. Messing with that was not a chaotic distraction. It was a declaration of germ warfare. The heavy hydraulic door thumped open, shattering the quiet. The low-gravity field of the cell flickered, causing a momentary, stomach-churning sensation of freefall. The door revealed Enos, framed by the bright white antiseptic light of the corridor. The logistical assessor looked enraged, his obsidian carapace twitching with barely contained fury. Behind him, two new enforcers, taller and more heavily armed than the last batch, stood ready. "You have created an acoustic anomaly, Shuren," Enos hissed, his voice amplified and sharp. "A minor flaw in the structural integrity, but intolerable. We are terminating the Chaos unit immediately." Cale pushed himself off the cold slab, standing only halfway upright in the reduced gravity. He stabilized his breathing, ignoring the throbbing pain in his left arm. His focus narrowed instantly to the ceiling panel, to the two remaining microlocks. Vera's warning, "Do not introduce contamination," was clear. Artis was running a technical play, not a physical one. If Cale introduced a bio-threat here, he risked compromising her maneuver and triggering an immediate violent quarantine response from the flagship's main defensive systems. "You're too late, Enos," Cale called out, his voice thin but steady. "I already cracked the access panel. You violate protocol the moment you enter." Enos tilted his head, his many eyes focusing on the minuscule damage Cale had inflicted. A single failed microlock is not contamination, human. It is inefficiency, a predictable, pathetic attempt at sabotage. You think I was going for the air logistics creep? Kale smiled, a dry, tired grimace that felt alien on his face. That panel doesn't just manage the atmosphere. It routes the ship's internal structural integrity, monitoring data directly to the Cortejo de Aiel's primary command spine. I didn't fail the lock, Enos. I forced the system to log a false positive, a 27% structural fatigue report on the detention hull. Check the sensors. The flagship thinks it's tearing itself apart, piece by piece. Enos's obsidian shell froze. Enos specialized in bureaucracy and logistics, and nothing terrified the Krillian bureaucracy more than an unsolvable engineering defect. Preposterous, Enos stated, but his eyes darted momentarily to a wrist display. He saw the report. Kyle could read the calculated panic in the Krillian's rigid posture. "It is a problem of simplicity, Enos," Kale pressed, leveraging his only remaining weapon, the enemy's rigidity. "Your system is so complex, so layered with redundancy and ritual purity, that it can't process a simple lie about a broken rivet. It's too busy managing 10,000 years of accumulated protocol to check the actual data. The fatigue report is active. That requires an immediate physical inspection by a designated structural integrity officer, according to Article 3412, subsection Gamma. You can't neutralize me until the structural integrity of the Chaos Unit containment area is confirmed." Enos snarled, a low buzzing sound that was pure frustration. "You cite our protocols to us?" "I studied the contract, Enos. You made me sign the damn thing. I learned your rules so I could learn where your blind spots are." The two enforcers, programmed for rapid termination, began to step forward, disregarding the protocol. "Stop," Enos commanded, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. He was caught between his protocol-driven need for validation and the tactical necessity of killing Kale immediately. The structural flaw report, even if false, was a Priority 1 event. "Vera," Kale whispered, knowing the AI was listening through the ship's infrastructure. "Artis's plan, what is she doing?" Vera's voice was now strained, barely audible. "She is attempting to overload the main manifold filter with non-catalytic hydrocarbons, old expired reaction mass from Nomara Dry. It's dense, viscous, and highly non-Krillian. If she succeeds, the flagship will initiate a full, localized atmospheric purge. It's an engineered panic attack for the whole vessel." Kale realized the timing was critical. Artis needed 10 minutes, the time it would take the viscous sludge to traverse the system and clog the primary atmospheric scrubbers. Kale's structural fatigue lie had bought them perhaps 90 seconds. "I need more time, Enos," Kale said, pushing the limits of his psychological advantage. "Send your enforcers in, and you violate the contamination quarantine. The false positive will spread across the whole hull grid. You risk a full fleet emergency evacuation on baseless data. Think of the logistics, Enos, the paperwork." That last word did it. Enos visibly recoiled, the thought of a catastrophic logistical failure far worse than a physical confrontation. "We wait here," Enos ordered the enforcers, who immediately locked their heavily armored stances, their laser rifles tracking Kale's every twitch. Kyle used the remaining seconds to move closer to the hatchling's compartment. The Gael continued its low, persistent whimper. Kyle knew the sound now, not pain, but intense, cold discomfort. The Krillian life support, distracted by Kale's forced chaos, was failing to maintain the delicate humidity and pressure balance the air required. "Enos, the Gael is in distress," Kale stated, pointing to the partition. "The localized system is failing. You must authorize a manual adjustment to the tertiary pressure valve, or the air will suffer permanent neurological damage from atmospheric instability." Enos looked genuinely conflicted. The air's welfare versus the human's demands. "I am authorized to manage the air's required environment, Enos," Kyle pushed, citing his despised Shaman of Simplification contract. "My utility is necessary. Grant me access to the manual valve." Enos hesitated for a brutal 30 seconds, the Enforcer's rifles never wavering. Finally, with a visible shudder of revulsion, Enos projected a temporary override code into the air. A small access hatch on the wall, separate from the primary ventilation panel, popped open. Kale scrambled to the hatch, pushing his throbbing left arm out of the way. Inside, the valve was a complex arrangement of fine silvery tubing and digital displays. It was utterly alien, but the underlying plumbing was universal. A bypass loop and a pressure release regulator. Kale didn't try to repair the hatchling's environment. He knew he couldn't. Instead, he grabbed 2 exposed tubes near the pressure regulator, a waistline, and a coolant conduit. He didn't have his multi-tool, but he had something better, the temporary pressure sleeve on his broken arm. It was Krillian bioengineering, strong, thin mesh designed to stabilize bone. He used the jagged exposed edge of a snapped stabilization strut on the pressure sleeve as a primitive knife. Ignoring the excruciating pain as the motion jarred the broken bones, he sawed at the coolant line. Thrrt! The thin tube ruptured, spraying a mist of hyper-chilled, inert gas across the room. The coolant was non-toxic but highly conductive. It instantly coated the exposed wiring inside the tertiary pressure valve, short-circuiting the environmental controls. The lights in the detention cell flickered and died. The ship's internal security system screamed in silent digital protest. The last sound Kale heard before the entire localized grid went dark was Enos's choked-off cry of pure logistical despair. Total darkness. Kale pushed himself back against the wall, panting, the smell of ozone and burnt plastic overwhelming the humid air. He had traded a false structural alarm for a localized power grid failure, a greater chaos, and therefore a greater delay. "He is active! Neutralize him!" Enos roared, his voice cutting through the sudden blackness. The Enforcers, equipped with thermal vision, immediately opened fire. Red energy bolts sliced through the space Kale had occupied moments before. Kale lunged not towards the door but towards the compartment holding the GAL. He slammed his body against the partition wall, the impact agonizing. The compartment was shielded, but Kale wasn't trying to break in. He was trying to maximize the localized chaos. The moment Kale made contact with the air's containment unit, the flagship's main alarm finally sounded. Not the tactical alarm, but the biological quarantine alert. A new voice, deeper, more authoritative than Enos, cut through the flagship's internal comms, echoing across the corridors. Containment breach. Non-Krillian contamination detected in Manifold Alpha. Initiate full atmospheric purge in sectors 5 through 9. Lock down all access to the GAL containment unit. The air is compromised. It was Artie's. Her timing was perfect. Kale heard the terrible sucking sound of the flagship's internal atmosphere being violently expelled. The effect was immediate. The air pressure in the corridor and Kale's cell began to drop rapidly. This was Krillian panic. They preferred vacuum to microbial contamination. Enos and the Enforcers staggered, their exoskeletons cycling into emergency pressure mode. Enos was yelling, lost in the technical catastrophe Kale had enabled. Kale, operating purely on engineer's instinct, scrambled back to the ceiling panel, using the sudden, intense depressurization to his advantage. He jammed his foot into the access seam he had created earlier and pulled with his good arm, using the negative pressure differential to rip the entire panel away. He reached inside the exposed circuitry, knowing this was the point of no return. He had to sever the connection between the detention module's life support and the GAL's containment unit. If the main ship went to vacuum, the air would die instantly unless Kale rerouted its tiny specialized life support to its own internal batteries. His bloody fingers found the junction box, a tangle of optical fibers and power relays. He gripped the main power conduit for the air's unit and ripped it free. A shower of sparks erupted, blinding him momentarily, The Guy Ailes' frantic clicking inside the wall stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming, the sound of its small internal batteries engaging. Cale had saved the air from the vacuum, but in doing so, he had effectively shut down its primary power source. He had replaced the ship's problem with an 80-hour deadline. He collapsed, deafened by the roar of the venting atmosphere and the sudden, intense white noise of the Krillian emergency sirens finally kicking in. The lights pulsed back on, revealing a chaotic scene. Anus shouting into his wrist display, his logistics reduced to wreckage, and the two enforcers struggling against the negative pressure differential, their heavy magnetic boots scrabbling for purchase. The air in the cell was thin, cold, and rapidly approaching vacuum. Cale forced himself onto his hands and knees, crawling toward the open doorway. "You failed, Enos," Cale gasped, his lungs burning with the lack of oxygen. "You chose bureaucracy over survival. The air is isolated. You have a contaminated flagship and a countdown on your asset." Enos finally looked at Kyle, his focus returning from the systemic chaos to the human variable. He launched himself forward, ignoring the depressurization, determined to end the interference. But the moment Enos crossed the cell boundary, Kyle felt Vera's projected voice, one last time, loud and clear, transmitted through the floor itself. "Kyle, Artis is secured. Her ship is gone. She is waiting at the secondary airlock. Go now. I will buy you time." Enos was less than 2 meters away. Cale didn't fight. He didn't punch. He did what he did best, exploit a failure state. He rolled sideways, grabbing the ankle of the nearest enforcer. The enforcer, weighted for low-gravity movement, was thrown completely off balance by the sudden, crude tug. It staggered, impacting Enos violently, just as the Krillian was about to seize Cale. The collision sent Enos sprawling, the logistical assessor skidding across the slick metal floor and into the wall of the Guy Ailes containment unit. Kyle used the resulting tangle of heavy armor and high-ranking Krillian officer as cover. He scrambled through the open door and into the flashing chaos of the corridor, his thin detention tunic offering no protection against the rapidly plummeting temperature. He ran, favoring his good leg, the pain in his broken arm a constant screaming reminder of the cost. He didn't know where the secondary airlock was, but he trusted Vera's guidance, racing down a corridor that was now choked with emergency sealant foam and strobing quarantine lights. He didn't look back. He ran towards Artis, towards the next layer of complication. He had destroyed the Krillian advantage, but the cost was total. His freedom was an illusion maintained by an AI sacrifice, his health was compromised, and they had no ship. He reached the secondary airlock, a battered utility door, marked only by a flashing yellow indicator. The door hissed open, revealing Artis Vale, dressed in a borrowed vacuum suit holding his rusty, beloved multi-tool. "You took your sweet time, engineer," Artis said, her voice dry through the suit comms, though her eyes were wide with relief and terror. Cale stumbled inside, leaning against the cold metal of the airlock wall. He pointed back down the corridor, now filling with pressurized containment foam. "We don't have a ship, Artis. I blew it up on the station." Artis looked at him, her expression hardening with grim determination. "I know, but I stole something better." She looked past Cale, out into the vast dark expanse of space, visible through the airlock's thick viewport. Cale followed her gaze. The Krillian flagship, the Cortejo de Isle, was not alone. 3 massive, heavily armored Krillian battleships, the vanguard of the scattered fleet, had materialized in scattered jump zones, their engines glowing with menace. They had arrived, just as Ennis promised, but they were not attacking. They were orbiting, waiting. And docked silently beneath one of the behemoths, looking like a tiny, aggressive insect, was the sleek, silver-gray hull of a heavily modified, high-speed, long-range diplomatic scout vessel, a Krillian Raumschiff. "You didn't just clog the filter, did you, Artis?" Kyle asked, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "No, Kyle," she confirmed. her hand resting on the smooth hull of the powerful stolen ship. I used the high-viscosity hydro sludge to contaminate the primary jump core stabilizers of this flagship. They can't jump and they can't run. They can only hold their ground and wait for the contamination to spread. I simplified their tactical options down to zero. Whom, she activated the airlock sequence. The outer door began to grind open onto the black void. "The flagship is paralyzed," Artis continued, pulling Kale towards the pilot seat. "But the rest of the Krillian fleet is here, watching. We have a fast ship, Kale, but we just declared war on 30,000 years of galactic civilization." Kyle strapped himself into the alien pilot seat, feeling the unfamiliar controls cold beneath his fingers. He looked at Artis, his partner, his failure, his rescue, the person who had just leveraged his chaos into a tactical victory of terrifying scope. "A simple maintenance job, huh?" Kale rasped, managing a painful dry chuckle. Artis met his gaze, her expression pure steel. "Nothing simple about it, engineer. This is where the long-term contract begins." The acceleration was brutal. Not the smooth warp transition of the flagship, but the violent slingshot maneuver of a small scout vessel pushed far past its recommended limits. Kyle felt the gravity compensator struggle, grinding out a high-pitched protest that was, ironically, quieter than the alarms they had just escaped. They jumped blind, several times slicing through non-aligned sectors of the Kepler belt, pushing the stolen Raumschiff toward systems that didn't possess enough value to merit Krillian jurisdiction. When Artis finally cut the engines and deployed the passive dampeners, the silence that followed was total. It was the vast, crushing quiet of deep space, a cold vacuum that amplified the internal sounds of the small, pressurized cabin, the ragged, uneven sound of Kale's own breathing, and the frantic, dry clicking of Artis working the navigation display. Kale leaned his head against the cold bulkhead, the synthetic fabric of the Krillian tunic doing little to absorb the chill. His left arm was a screaming, throbbing mess of dull, permanent pain. The specialized pressure sleeve he'd used as a saw had failed catastrophically under the depressurization, leaving the exposed bone ends grinding against the muscle. He was alive, but the cost was tattooed onto his body. "We are in the fringe of the Cygnus Gap," Artis announced, her voice tight, having shed the confidence of the battle for the focused dread of the aftermath. "It's thin on resources, heavily mined, and zero infrastructure. Perfect." Kale didn't move. He closed his eyes, remembering the smell of burnt ozone and plastic from the short-circuited containment unit. He was counting his losses. "Vera?" he rasped. Artis shook her head, not looking away from the monitor. "I routed her last transmission through a dozen civilian convoys before she went dark. She didn't sacrifice herself for a clean kill, Kale. She sacrificed herself for silence. She's probably just a memory core now, quarantined in the flagship's auxiliary storage. Unreachable." Kyle felt a dull ache that wasn't physical. He had lost his last constant, the dry synthetic presence that demanded only routine. "The Gi'ayel," Kale said, forcing himself to sit upright, his eyes immediately going to the pressurized compartment they had hastily jury-rigged in the scout's tiny cargo hold. The compartment was small, heavily shielded, and designed to carry delicate diplomatic cargo. Now, it carried their entire future. 80 hours, Mikael," Artis confirmed, her use of his full name confirming the seriousness of the situation. 78. Now, maybe less. "We ripped out the primary power feed. The Krillian air is running on its own internal, highly specialized emergency reserves. It's cold in there. It's waiting for maintenance." Kale pushed himself out of the pilot seat, favoring his good arm, and moved carefully to the cargo hold partition. He knelt, placing his ear against the cold metal. Inside, the hatchling was producing a sound. It was no longer the mechanical cry of distress, nor the rhythmic clicking of recognition. It was a low, steady thump, 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 the methodical, heavy beat of a Krillian biological life support system fighting for every second. A pulse he was now solely responsible for maintaining. We blew up your isolation. We blew up my diplomatic clearance. We paralyzed the flagship. And we stole their newest, fastest piece of hardware, all to guarantee a future where we are permanently hunted by an entire galactic civilization, Coyle murmured, a wry edge to his voice. Artis finally turned, leaning back in the pilot seat, watching him. She looked utterly exhausted, her eyes shadowed, but the steel was still there. We didn't declare war, Cale. We forced a negotiation, she corrected. The Krillians value their air more than their dignity. They cannot risk a direct physical assault that could kill the guy Ale. They will track us, and they will try to recover their asset using logistics. They will send Enos. Enos will be furious, Cale noted, a thin, dry smile crossing his face. Furious and meticulous. We bought ourselves a temporary operational window, a buffer. We need to find somewhere with enough high-quality coolant and biocatalytic agents to stabilize the air for the long run. We need to prove we are necessary to its survival, not just a threat. Cale reached up, his good hand wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. The sweat was mixing with the dried residue of burnt ozone and the grime he'd tracked onto the stolen, sterile deck plates. It smelled like Nomara Dre, only colder. He had started this to escape the burden of a maintenance contract, to find the blessed anonymity of a dusty, broken station near the Kepler belt. Now, he was the sole engineer responsible for the life of the most politically sensitive biological asset in the quadrant, aboard a ship that broadcast his status as a high-value criminal. He was Mikhail Shurin again, not Kyle, because this level of catastrophic responsibility required his full identity. So we run a deep space service call, Cale summarized, standing up and retrieving his multi-tool, which Artis had guarded. The tool felt right and familiar in his hand, despite the alien surroundings. It was chipped, rusty, and completely necessary. It's a very long contract, engineer. No rest, no retirement, Artis said. Kyle slid the tool back into his belt holster, feeling the familiar weight. He looked out the viewport into the silent, star-dusted void. The vacuum was vast, infinite, cold, and utterly indifferent to his broken arm or his philosophical malaise. He had sought the structured, isolating quiet of a dead station, but he had only found the kind of silence that demanded constant, active vigilance. He had wanted to stop the noise, but he had only succeeded in transforming it into a permanent, internal rhythm, the sound of the hatchling's fragile heartbeat, dictating every move they made from now until the end. He didn't regret saving the hatchling. He regretted accepting the job. That was the difference between impulse and destiny. He turned back toward Artis, toward the cockpit controls, toward the faint, steady pulse coming from the cargo hold. The silence was total now, deep space quiet, interrupted only by that small rhythmic sound. The universe always found a way to give a working man a job, and the pay was always too low. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.